Laura Miller has really a fascinating career, honestly, which I knew about prior to meeting her in person. She was on the, do we call it the good side or the bad side? She was on the good side as a reporter for a very long time in Miami, Dallas, and New York. She ran, she was on the Dallas City Council. She was the mayor of Dallas. And she is now, I want to make sure I get this title right, the current director of Texas Project for the Seattle-based Summit Power Group. To her left is Haley Barbour, who has done many things in politics. 8 years as the governor of Mississippi, an RNC, a Republican National Committee chairman. I didn't know this, dropped out of college to work on Richard Nixon's presidential campaign and later served as political director of the Reagan White House. Governor Barbour is, if you look up Republican in the dictionary, you got picture Governor Barbour, and he is one of the most, that's been a good and a bad thing over your life, and one of the most sort of genial and I think friendly and reasonable politicians who have been at this a very long time. To his left, to my far left, yes, appropriately, we're positioning them ideologically. We have it planned to a T. Is Carol Browner. She was President Clinton's EPA Administrator, President Obama's Energy and Climate Change Policy Director, and today she is both the Policy and Business Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress and a Senior Advisor to the Albright Stonebridge Group. Did I get all of that basically right?
Yes. Okay,
good. That's good. That's impressive. I can pronounce your names right. That's what I always count for. We're going to talk about energy with all three of them. Governor Barbour, though, I can't not ask you, and I know you talked about it this morning, but obviously the big conversation right now, Governor Nikki Haley in South Carolina yesterday made an announcement about her desire to have the Confederate flag removed from the state complex. You were on Morning Joe this morning. I have your quote. You said, "I am not offended at all by our flag, the Mississippi state flag, which does have the Confederate logo, or the Confederate flag for that matter, but some people are." Now, the Speaker of the State House, a Republican in Mississippi, said we need to, last night, said we need to consider the possibility of changing that logo on the flag. Tell me why you stand where you do, which is increasingly not a position held by most prominent Republicans.
Well, look, my position is very straightforward. South Carolina should decide how they want to decorate their state capitol. It's not for the Washington Post or for NBC. It's for South Carolina, and they are making a decision, apparently, that because if you saw the news conference, it wasn't just Governor Haley.
No, not at all.
It was both senators. It was a bunch of Republicans, a bunch of Democrats, white, black. So they're making a decision that they are going to take that flag off the Capitol grounds. Mississippi's Speaker of the House, a Republican, said yesterday he thinks Mississippi has got to consider that they've got to, as he said, we need to start a conversation because the flag is offensive to some people. I think that was the stimulus of why I was asking, was it offensive to me?
Right.
It's not offensive to me, but it is offensive to some people. And it's a serious discussion. We did this 15 years ago with my state. There was a group who wanted to change the state flag and had a referendum. And the referendum, the old state flag, which has been our state flag since 1894. This is not something that was stimulated by the civil rights movement in the 1960s. It's been our state flag for 120 years. The flag was that people voted not to change it. Now they're going to look at that again. And that's where the decision ought to be made in Mississippi.
And you would be in favor of another ballot initiative if the people were supportive of that?
Unless the legislature decides to do it themselves.
Okay. And you would, do you prefer?
I'm not concerned. It doesn't concern me a bit for the legislature to do it. I don't think a person ought to do it. I don't think the governor should have that power, but it ought to be done through a process. The state legislature made this the state flag in 1894. Right. So at least the legislature ought to undo it if there's not a referendum.
Okay, I appreciate it, and thank you all for your willingness to listen to that. I was just
what do you think?
I was just interested.
Well, I'm just thinking about what kind of electricity there was.
Yeah.
But I think the next question for you should be, when are you going to announce for the presidential? Because there's so many.
My political future's behind me.
Both of ours.
I was asked today, well, why don't you say what you're for? And I said, because I realize The last thing the governor wants to hear is, well, the old governor thinks we ought to do so-and-so.
Well, the way we used to do it, let me bring it to energy, and I want to bring it to the Pope, who put out a 184-page document on climate change last week. And I want to quote, because I thought this was fascinating. The Pope, obviously we know it's a somewhat political office, right? But not sort of seen as above politics for most people. But there was a lot of political understanding in this document. I'm quoting from him here. And Carol, I want to start with you, and we'll go this way toward me. Here's what he said. The myopia of power politics delays the inclusion of a far-sighted environmental agenda within the overall agenda of governments. Essentially that we do government by triage. We sort of whack the gophers that pop up, and the ones that are longer term and doing us real damage, we don't handle. You've been in government. Is that an accurate description? And if so, how do you change it?
Well, first let me just start with saying, as a lapsed Catholic, I think the Pope is awesome. I think what he is doing on pressing issues, whether it's within the church or outside of the church, is quite significant. I think that he decided to have an encyclical on the issue of climate really drives home the fact that, yes, it's an energy issue. It's also a poverty issue. It's a women's issue. This is a serious issue for the world. You know, as a former regulator, and I don't have 3 eyes and 2 horns. Regulators sometimes maybe do, but I don't. You know, one of the things that I think it's important to always remember is you're running a large agency. I was honored to run the EPA for 8 years. I wasn't free to do just anything, right? Congress gave me a law. Congress passed the Clean Air Act, or maybe you were there in 1990, and said, we want the following things done. At which point then the agency decides what's the best way to do them. And they have to do it in a way that's public and engages the industry and governors and environmentalists, et cetera. And then they have to defend it in court. And so there were many times in my tenure at EPA where I looked at the Clean Air Act, or I looked at the Clean Water Act, and I thought, might not be what I would think about doing, but that's not my choice. Congress has given me a law. And you know, one of the things we hear a lot about today is that the president is using executive authority. When the president, and he's done many, many things, is putting forth requirements that will drive down greenhouse gas or carbon pollution, he is doing that all subject to the 1990 Clean Air Act. He's not just waking up one day and deciding to do something. So yes, it can feel, I think, a little abstract to people, but it comes through our form of government, which is a legislative action, an executive branch implementation, and then a judicial review.
I think Carol is being much too humble. And when you talked about the Pope, I thought you meant Carol as the climate czar. But
yeah, climate czarina. Yeah,
you know,
nice.
when you took over the EPA, you decided to do something about soot and smog, which hadn't been addressed in many, many years. And even though you had the president's support and the vice president's support, when industry came after you, you pretty much stood by yourself, dug in, really smart, all your facts, and you said, this is why we have to do this for the country. And after almost getting killed for it, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously upheld what you fought for. So I believe very strongly that just like the governor took care of his state after Katrina and gave a lot of stabilization and a lot of comfort to the people of his state, I think one politician, one elected official can do an enormous amount when they put their minds to it, if they have the facts and they're on the right side.
Thank you.
I want to follow up, and Governor Barbour, I'll start with you on this, which is, I take your point about one person. At the same time, politicians tend to, when they are running for things, talk to, and this doesn't include you,
I've never run for anything.
Right, but it does include the governor. That's why I'm going to him. They talk about usually what people say they care most about. And before I came over here, I looked this up just because I was interested and I knew I was doing this. Gallup does a poll every month. They ask people, what's your top issue or priority? What's the biggest priority facing the country? And I went through, it's an open-ended question. So you could literally say, you know, the rise of Minecraft among kids, right? I mean, you can say whatever you want. Well, I mean, I have a 6-year-old. So it's a very present issue to me. I tried to find anything that had to do with energy, climate, environment, right? I was trying to use the broadest suite possible. Here's what I came up with. 3% of people said environment/pollution, some combo of that. 1%, and again, I was doing the broad swath, 1% said fuel/oil prices, and then energy / lack of energy resources for the future, which I think almost everybody party-wise agrees that that's a problem going forward. It was asterisk in the June poll, which means that it was under 1%. It had been 1%, I think, in March, and it had dipped down to asterisk. So to your point, Mayor, I get that one person can affect change, but Governor, how do you, when people don't seem to have it as a top of the mind issue, when you're in office, how do you prioritize doing certain things that may not have a short-term political or policy gain for the long term?
Well, let me first of all say that I am a dour Calvinist, not a lapsed Catholic. And so we Presbyterians have less admiration for what popes say.
Yeah, probably less guilt too. But yeah.
Yeah, less guilt.
But it does surprise me that climate change and the environment are very low, because we've been in a very weak economy for 7 years, and a lot of people are not working. 48% of Americans who are adults have a full-time job, the lowest since the 70s. You got about 62% labor force participation rate. So yeah, most people say the economy and jobs. Some certainly we're at a time of more national security concern than in many, many, many years. So it doesn't surprise me. But look, I used to work for Ronald Reagan. I ran the political office of the White House, as you said. Ronald Reagan used to say, at the end of the day, good policy is good politics. He did all sorts of things that weren't particularly popular. And a lot of people who disagree with him voted for him anyway. And he knew how to get things done. Unlike this administration, when we had divided government in the Reagan administration, which was every day, we had a Democratic House. You know, we did the Reagan economic plan, we did Social Security reform, we did immigration reform, we did the 1986 tax reform. I mention those because they're all big, complicated, complex, and contentious. But the president's got to lead, and lots of times the president has to lead for things that are not particularly popular. This president's methodology for leading is to kind of act like he is Pope, that he can do whatever he wants to. Even after he says over and over and over, I don't have the power to do that, then to ultimately do it.
I want to go to the audience for questions after this question. It's like the Bill Clinton, I'm going to make it short. I'm going to make a short speech and then go on for 35 more minutes. I want to follow up on this because Carol, you mentioned it, and I want to go to the mayor first on it, which is one person can make a big difference, but you just heard Governor Barbour say this president is acting like the Pope. We've had executive order. The federal government needs to cut greenhouse gas emissions by 40% from 2008 to 2018, increase share of renewable energy. Last June, and we're coming up on the rule, we expect the rule sometime later this summer on the EPA and coal-fired emissions at coal plants. This is not something that you have Republicans, whether they're governors or whether they're in the House and Senate, saying, that seems like a good idea. So how do you find common ground between these things happening in the way they are and sort of good policy making good politics? How do you reconcile the fact that the president is acting, to Carol's point, I guess she would say acting because that's all he can do, or he's acting within the limits of what he can do, but how do you reconcile Republican opposition there?
If you take out politics and you just look at the facts are that most Americans realize that the planet is warming and that humans are helping that to a great extent. And so even in a place like Texas, where, as we all know, our elected officials like to sue the EPA, we also have the largest municipally owned electrical utility in the country, which is the city of San Antonio. And Doyle Beneby, who's the CEO of that, took the job in 2010 and decided, well, my first thing to decide is, do I spend $500 million cleaning up a 40-year-old dirty coal plant, putting a scrubber on it, thanks to what you did at EPA, but never having carbon capture, or do I just close the plant and do something better and diversify my portfolio and spend it on solar and wind and efficiency and all those, and nuclear, and that's what he did. So we have a very progressive city that is currently got nine solar farms that are being produced in Texas, who is actually, City of San Antonio is buying our power. We are developing a power plant in West Texas with coal gasification, which means very, very low emissions. And we are capturing 90% of our CO2. It'll be the first power plant in the world that captures 90% of its CO2, a new construction project. And San Antonio is buying our power and shutting down a 40-year-old dirty coal plant. So I think it goes beyond who is the president, or who is the governor, or who is the mayor. I think it comes down to our kids, our age. My kids are going to make sure that we tackle climate change. And so we'd better join in now and help them out. And all of us have done a lot toward that, to just diversify, have a better energy portfolio, and do what people want.
So, they're not my age. Let me correct that part. Okay, go ahead.
Wait, two points
and then we'll go to the audience.
The mayor's example of San Antonio is like spot on, because this has to happen at all levels. If we're going to change our energy system in this country, it's not going to be simply because of an EPA regulation or a new law from Congress. It's going to be because local governments make decisions, because businesses make decisions. But I do think it's really important to on the power plant rule, which will be announced later this summer, where EPA will put restrictions on carbon emissions from existing power plants. The Supreme Court has already upheld this authority. And once they did that, EPA had to start regulating. And the first regulations I was proud to be a part of were cars and trucks. And they were done with the industry, and they are fully supporting those regulations. There is no reason why this next round can't have a similar feel to it. And governors in the next round will actually write the individual state plans. Now, you know, on carbon, on carbon, it is a complicated pollutant, because unlike ones we have dealt with historically, unlike the ones that drove Richard Nixon to create the Environmental Protection Agency, you were probably in there arguing for it, right? Back in the day.
I was too young then.
but you know, he created it because people said, you know what, the Cuyahoga River's on fire. You could see the pollution, you could touch it, you could feel it. The problem with carbon is if we wait till we can see it, feel it, touch it, to the mayor's point, it will be too late. And so we've got to get going on this if we're going to have a reasonable shot at doing things in a common sense, cost-effective manner. It is doable.
Governor, I saw you raise your eyebrows. You have the last word on this.
Yeah, well, just as a governor, EPA's Clean Power Rule goes far beyond regulation in the traditional sense. It essentially takes over energy policy. My Public Service Commission, elected independent of me as governor, they didn't and don't work for the governor. They are the ones that have designed our energy system. It works very well. We have low rates, but they're going to be forced to create a new set of standards because of EPA. They're going to be, and EPA will effectively control electricity policy, not just pollution policy, electricity policy, and it's going to make the costs go up. Let's not, you know, a lot of people sitting here probably haven't thought about, last year energy prices in the United States collapsed. Electricity prices went up 4%. At a time when the fuel was going through the floor, we had the biggest increase in electricity prices in the modern era, maybe since we started. It went up 4%. What would it have done if we had a typical year with the energy prices? Why did it go up? Well, according to the Washington Post, because of regular...
Unimpeachable.
Impeach is a bad word around us guys that have been elected. But your own newspaper has made the point. It's been regulatory impositions, and it's been government policy that's driven up these costs. And now, the only thing that the customer wants more than low, affordable rates is reliability. And the administration has closed 10 coal plant every 10 days since they've been in, and coal still provides 40% of our electricity, and it is hurting. It is threatening reliability.
But the mayor,
we need to have more coal plants.
Very quickly.
The governor and I have something in common, though. Because we're both oil-rich states, We happen to have the two best new construction coal-fueled plants that are capturing carbon, and they're going to be used to bring up more oil, which is a good thing. So there are all kinds of partnerships here that work for the whole country that I think are very promising.
Governor, I'm sure you have a thought on that, but I want to open it up. Do people have questions? Sir, in the front, can we get a mic just before you start, please?
Yeah, hi, Wolfgang Schäfer of Georgetown International. My question is, with the declining gas prices, would that have been a good opportunity to increase the gas tax with two objectives? Number one, reduce our CO2 emissions, and number two, to be able to repair our decaying infrastructure? Thank you.
I'll say quickly, politicians never think it's necessarily a good time to raise taxes, but
so we have another issue with the trust fund that's just worth reminding people. It's the good news, maybe bad news. Our cars, because of government action, are becoming more fuel efficient. So every time you fill up, you are going to go further on a gallon of gas, which means you're going to buy less gas and produce less pollution, supported by the car industry. And so even without Congress taking action, we had this other issue coming on our highway trust fund. You know, I personally believe that we might want to think about a different way of funding the trust fund. We might want to look at vehicle miles traveled. We could look at how much are you actually driving your car. Now, gasoline has been something of a way to think about that. But then we could also go through a situation where poor people, less fortunate people, low-income people, they could be held harmless from that. Right now, the gas tax hits everybody, and it doesn't really hit people equally, right, in terms of where they sit in the sort of economic strata. And so I wonder if it isn't a chance. We have an aging infrastructure problem in this country. It is a significant problem, and we do need to do something about it. I don't know that this is the Congress that can think these ways, but maybe thinking differently than we've thought previously.
Let me make this point to you that I think is very important and very rarely mentioned, particularly in this town. If you take the gasoline tax that we're collecting today and only use it for bridges and highways, it funds about 99%. What's happened is we're supporting mass transit out of the gasoline tax, theoretically a user fee. Gasoline tax, I buy gas, I use the highways, I pay a tax on my gas, that's my user fee. But we're taking about 35% of that user fee and we're spending on something else. In this very, very nice city that I get to spend a lot of time in, we have maybe the best mass transit system in the United States. But less than half the cost is borne by the person riding the metro. And if we can keep the gas tax where it is if we spend it all on what it was originally for.
Can I ask?
We may have to come back and have a tax panel.
Yeah.
The philosophy of tax.
That's in the 4 o'clock hour.
Okay.
Mayor, I want to ask you because Carol mentioned something that I always, every State of the Union, which I am paid to watch, so I watch them all. Not that I wouldn't anyway. Every president, Republican, Democrat, says, and our nation's infrastructure is crumbling, and now is the time to do something about it. And yet, now never appears to be the time to do something about it. Can you talk about your experiences? Usually, the smaller sample size, the easier to do. That's why doing things at the federal level, healthcare reform, for example, is very difficult. Energy reform is very difficult. Are there experiences that you have as sort of an incubator, whether in your former life as a politician or in your current life, that suggests there are ways that you can actually make good on saying our fill-in-the-blank highways and byways are crumbling?
Well, I think it's a fair statement that in every big city in America, the #1 problem is the condition of the roads and potholes. That's what every single local politician hears about.
Some national politicians, too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very significant problem. And so the bridges and the roads and the levee systems, I mean, look at the enormous trouble that we had with Katrina, all the deficiencies that exposed. And that bled into Dallas, because we have a downtown that's on a river. It's not very well developed yet. We're trying to do that. But when that 800-year flood hits, then downtown Dallas will be underwater. So we have to spend an enormous amount of money, more so than ever before because of Katrina, because the Corps of Engineers has made it very clear that they're going to demand that we protect our cities. And so it's a very, very significant problem. And I think that we have to find, I think energy has a lot to do with it. I think we have to find ways for people to use less electricity and to more efficient buildings and better construction and all of these things. And I do wish that the tone in Washington would improve, because it's the head of the snake, and we all look to it for ultimate answers. And I'm just, we all hope that at some point, if they start cooperating like the three of us are today, I think that it would be a lot better for everybody.
Chris, let me just say, again, not very reported, but Congress last year started fixing infrastructure problems, and they raised fuel taxes. As you know, we've had tremendous problems with our inland waterways. They raised the fuel tax from 20 cents to 29 cents, so almost by half, to fund the inland waters of the Mississippi and the other rivers that are navigable. What they need to do is now go on and do the ports. The Panama Canal expansion is about to be over in the next year or so. We can't take most of the post-Panamax ships. Yet, for the last several years, half the money paid into the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund has been diverted and not spent on ports and harbors. If we just took the money we were already collecting, again in a user fee, and spent it on ports instead of called it deficit reduction, we could get our ports ready. It's going to be a hell of a note when the Singapore of North America, after the Panama Canal opens, turns out to be Mariel, Cuba, because we hadn't spent the money. So it's not just roads, but those are two things. It's a solution, pretty obvious.
But I think, because we're talking about the different branches of government here, I think it's real, and maybe people know this, it's worth noting, this is Congress that's doing this. Congress is deciding to go into trust funds. Right. Now, I don't necessarily have a problem with it, I know you do, because I think the Congress is free to make these kind of budgetary decisions. And that I'm not a big fan of, quote, user fees. That's something that, because you pay here, can only be spent there. I think Congress has to be rational and think about how they spend money. But this is not the White House, this is not the president, this is Congress making annual budgetary decisions.
But there are ways to spend money to make money. For example, on the power plant that is in your state, and the power plant that we're going to build in my state, if you put money into building big power plants and industrial facilities that capture carbon, and you take that carbon and you put it in the ground to bring up more oil, right. You take all the incentives that you would spend to build those carbon capture projects, and you get it paid back in oil royalties to the federal government. And so it's a wash. We have half the country has old power plants that are fueling our economy, and we have got to put carbon capture equipment on all of those facilities. But you can do it and not just have it be a loss expense. You can do it and put it in the ground and bring up oil.
Well, then that raises the question, why is it not being done?
Because we don't have a cap on carbon. Well, we'll create a market. So one of the things to remember about government regulations... But I knew you would like that line. One of the things to remember about... At least I didn't say the three-letter word. One of the things to remember about government regulations, and I can give you examples all afternoon, which I won't do, is every time you set a requirement for someone to reduce their pollution, you create a market opportunity. Someone has to make the solution. Someone has to make the widget. American ingenuity and innovation rises to the challenge and finds a better way to solve a pollution problem every time the government says...
Catalytic converters.
Catalytic converters is a great example.
Governor, I want to talk about your state in particular, in Kemper, with this huge plant being built by Southern Company. Over budget and late.
It's supposed to cost about $4 billion. No, Vogel's the nuclear plant.
Yeah, okay. I thought that's
it's a clean coal plant.
Clean coal.
And it's costing about $6 billion.
Right.
I think it has to be said, importantly, the ratepayers nor the taxpayers will pay for that. The company is paid to cost overrun.
But what does that plant was, at least by some, seen as sort of, this will be the shining example of how this can be done. Can it still be that, given the overruns?
I don't think there's any question about it. It's going to be more expensive than we thought, but mostly because of design issues. We can go into that. They don't care about that. I don't blame them. But it does capture carbon and sells it into the oil field. The problem, Carol, with mandating that by the government is that most power plants are not going to be located where you can sell it into the oil field.
But it's not mandated.
Text.
It's a solution
Well,
if
you
they
said,
choose it. No.
you said the government should mandate carbon capture.
No, I said, no, I didn't say carbon capture. This is really important. I said a cap on carbon. In other words, we have to reduce the amount of carbon writ large in the atmosphere. And sometimes it might be carbon capture, and sometimes it might be energy efficiency, and sometimes it might be clean nuclear.
Very importantly, there are places in the United States where this works, because the oil field is close by. The other caps that she's talking about, that's why we have the largest increase in electricity rates last year when fuel prices were going down. Again, don't take my word for it. The administration's policy has been to drive up fuel.
One more defense
very quickly,
of
and I want to
Kemper.
get one more question.
The first projects that actually capture the carbon instead of letting them go up into the sky are going to cost more money. And once you start doing more of them, it'll be just as expensive as any other plant that's ever been built.
Okay, so I think
Just
it's really
like
important.
catalytics on
Can I
cars.
just clarify something here? The administration has proposed requirements for power plants to reduce their carbon emissions. They have not finalized those.
That's this summer.
That's this summer. What they have finalized is a requirement for power plants that emit mercury, which is a neurotoxin. Remember Madden's the Hatter and Alice in Wonderland? To reduce the mercury. There are costs associated with taking a neurotoxin out of the air. So when we talk about, and Governor, I am not familiar with the cost increases you're talking about, whether those are averages or whether there may be some site-specific things there, I don't know. But there is not yet a requirement on power plants to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. There is a requirement for mercury.
Can I?
Well, I'll just say that about the fact I mentioned is published by the Obama administration, by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They publish an electricity price index that they've been publishing for.
We have a minute left, so I'm not going to go to another question because I worry we won't answer it. But I will ask this: is we talk about cooperation, we talk about solutions that can happen, but the truth of the matter is, in my 30 minutes of analyzing the three people on the stage, is there are significant disagreements, I don't want to say on the facts, but certainly on approach. So give me in 10 seconds or 15 or 30 seconds, we're going to start with the mayor, give me a reason for optimism that Washington or not, that there is reason to hope for cooperation as it relates to alternative energy sources.
Because every single day, more people realize that we have to stop putting carbon in the air. It's just a fact. And so we're going to come up with solutions to do that. And yes, we had disagreements, but at the end of the day, all of us are moving in the same direction. We both have a power plant that captures carbon. She helped do rules that are making us do that today. And so we're all going to get there together. And San Antonio is a good reason for that. What we have done, the three of us individually, is all taking us to this place.
Governor?
Well, if we will follow what the administration has proclaimed, all of the above energy policy, abundant, affordable American energy is the solution for our economy, for manufacturing in the United States, for getting control of prices. But we need policies that are not designed to drive up the cost so people will use less energy. And you know who said that would be the Obama administration's policy? Barack Obama. He said, under my cap and trade plan, electricity rates will necessarily skyrocket. This is one place been pretty successful.
Carol?
I believe the biggest problem the world faces is carbon pollution. It will radically change the future for our children, and I'm actually a grandparent, our grandchildren. I am optimistic because I do not believe we will be the first generation to leave to our children and our grandchildren a problem they cannot solve. We will have hard-fought arguments about the best way to do it, but at the end of the day, we will change the makeup of energy in this country, and it will be good for all of us.